back to another Mackem in the Middle podcast, and once again another match preview ahead of Monday's game away to Middlesbrough, which is of course a game that is broadcast live on Sky Sports. And to get the opposition view, I am joined by Craig, who is of course a Middlesbrough reporter for the Gazette. How are you getting on, mate? You doing well?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks very much for having me on.
No worries. And I bet you're feeling a bit tired after what happened yesterday. It's always a busy day, isn't it? Deadline day, regardless who comes in and who goes out.
That's it. Yeah, it's one of those days where I think even for journalists, you want to be at the centre of any big stories, and ultimately at Middlesbrough, nothing did happen, but we were expecting a busy day, so it's one of them where you kind of logging on early and on throughout the day, doing half 8 hours. I was logged onto the laptop and not switching it off until after midnight, even though Middlesbrough ultimately let 2 players go, and that was the only business they did all day. So a busy day without anything happening in a strange kind of way.
Yeah. Exactly the same as Sunderland. We'll get straight into it because there is plenty to talk about surrounding obviously the two teams and the game on Monday, starting with Middlesbrough. Obviously, it's been a tough start to the season, I would say, so far for Middlesbrough, currently in 20th, just one win in their opening 7 games. And obviously the most recent games, a 2-1 win against Swansea, a 2-1 defeat against Watford, and of course 1-0 defeat against Reading in the last 3. What have you made of the start of the season so far for Middlesbrough?
It's been such a strange start of the season, really. That's the best way I can describe it. They had obviously build a lot of momentum towards the end of last season. Chris Wilder coming in November really helped transform the team, got them playing a really attractive style of football, a really clear style and system to how they wanted to go about the way they played. Had a really good FA Cup run, beating Manchester United and Tottenham. Narrowly missed out on the playoffs, but they'd come a long way to go from 14th when Wilder took over to finish 7th, just outside. And you felt then going into the summer, it was going to be a big summer. It was always going to be a big overhaul. In the end, they brought in 10 players, but I think everyone appreciates that they're probably still 3 signings short of where the idea wanted to be. So really, 13 signings, what they should have got. That was always going to be a big overhaul for them. But yeah, there was a lot of positive momentum and a lot of hope about Middlesbrough coming into the start of this season. I think they did do. There's some of the 10 players that they brought in are very impressive signings. You're signing Zach Steffen to go in goal, who was last season he was Manchester City's number 2. Ryan Giles, who by January last season was the Championships. He was top of the assist table in the Championship, and he's continued that form into last season. Darrell Lenihan comes in from Blackburn on a free, and he's probably been one of the Championship's top defenders for the last 3 or 4 years, I would say. So some very good business that they did, and then with that in mind, expected results to be better, but it's such a hard one to analyze because performances have actually on the whole been very good, and they've played very well in the majority of games. I would say really a mad kind of 30 minutes at QPR where they just started terribly and shot themselves in the foot ultimately 3 times and were 3-0 down after 30 odd minutes. Actually came back and probably should have got something out of that game. Lost it 3-2 in the end, but had chances where they should have at least taken a draw from it and should have had a penalty in that game as well. And that 30 minutes there, and then Reading, where you come away from Reading, they lose 1-0. They absolutely dominated possession. They had all of the ball. I think Reading had ultimately 1 shot on goal, and it went in. But Boro were really poor that day in terms of carrying out what they want to do in possession, as I'm sure we'll talk more in detail about. They want to be quick, they want to play at a quick tempo and move the ball about fast, and they didn't do that at Reading, and so ultimately it was easy for Reading to kind of defend against that, because they weren't being moved about and they didn't have to think too hard about keeping the structure and the shape. But with the exception of kind of that 90 minutes and 30 minutes at QPR, Boro have played really well and warranted a lot more in terms of results than what they've ultimately got. But yeah, big issue is ultimately, as I mentioned with QPR, shooting themselves in the foot. They conceded too many goals, and the majority of the goals that they're conceding are coming from their own mistakes ultimately.
Yeah. I think it's a very similar story to Sunderland so far this season in terms of performances probably haven't matched the level of points that we've picked up. Again, just before we started recording, obviously mentioned the QPR game where we played well. You concede a diving header to a goalkeeper in the last minute. That's not going to happen every week. You go down to 10 men against Sheffield United, who of course one of the favourites for promotion. You're going to lose that game 2-1. Probably should have got a point, if not 3, if we had 11 men on the pitch. So I think, especially at this stage of the season, although obviously 3 points in a game are massive and you want to be up the right end of the table, I think the main thing to take away from games is the performance at this point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's fair. I mean, as you see, you don't want to kind of lose, too many points on those at the top end of the table if that's ultimately where you want to be challenging, which is certainly the case for Middlesbrough this season. But yeah, the performances are there. There's something to if you like to hang your hat on. If the performances weren't there and you weren't getting results, then perhaps you would worry more. But because the performances are there, and with Boro, I mentioned that they've done 10 deals this summer, but some of the more key deals, some of the more critical deals came later in the window. So,
Yeah.
for example, throughout the summer, Wilder was adamant that he wanted a left-footed centre back. He didn't have one last season. Paddy McNair ultimately played that role last season. Someone who Sunderland fans know well, of course, and he's a fine defender since Neil Warnock, really, who converted him back to a centre back and made clear that that's where his best position was. He's been excellent for Boro in the last kind of 2 seasons as a centre back, but with Chris Wilder's style, particularly in possession, I think most who watch these Sheffield United team will remember kind of the overlapping centre backs, and the two wide centre backs do like to get forward and do like to get involved in the attack. And one thing Boro didn't have last season, and what was that left-footed centre back who would ultimately go past the wing back, get the ball, and could cross it in naturally with a left foot. When Paddy McNair played the role, he would have to come back onto his right foot to do that, and ultimately that slows things down again a bit, which makes it just gives defenses that little split second extra to kind of regroup, reshape, or whatever. So takes away from the kind of the style and the ethos of how Chris Wilder wants it to look. So yeah. They finally got Mark Clark in, I think it was a week or so ago now, and he made his debut in the Swansea win, so far the only win of the season for Boro. But it was evident in that one just how much having that balance at the back made a difference. Matt Clark linked up brilliantly with Ryan Giles, who I mentioned for the second goal that Boro scored, and it was just so evident how important that was. So I think within those results, performances have been good, but they have still had important positions that they've needed to fill as well, which hasn't helped results.
Yeah. And obviously, it's just under 10 months since Chris Wilder took charge. Obviously, Neil Warnock was there previously. So, in terms of looking at the two managers and the way they kind of shape up the teams, the tactics they play, the type of football they play, it's very two different styles. And how quickly have Middlesbrough been able to change to that kind of Chris Wilder football? Because as we've seen in the Premier League when he was at Sheffield United, especially that first season when they got promoted, it can be very effective if used correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think broadly speaking, they took on board how we wanted to play very quickly, and there was very quickly an upturn in results and performances last season, and there was a lot of positives to take, which, as I say, ultimately led to coming into this season with a lot of hope and a lot of expectation too. I think it's more now the kind of more intricate details of exactly how he wants it to look. As I say, that balance that I mentioned with the left-footed centre back is a key thing. So obviously getting Matt Clark in recently was a big signing for them, and the kind of the way they want to move the ball about in the final third, and the movements that need to happen, that they're little intricate details that are still coming together. But ultimately, I think when you look at kind of how they've performed broadly over Wilder's time in charge, they took those ideas on really well, and it seemed to really suit the players that Boro have at the disposal. And so the key issues really for them so far this season has been, just making sloppy errors, basically making mistakes, giving the ball away in situations or areas of the pitch that you really can't afford to give the ball away in, not clearing crosses commandingly enough, and ultimately it's proved costly to keep being punished for reasons such as that.
Yeah. And obviously, two players that are at Middlesbrough nowadays are two players at Sunderland will be very familiar with, obviously Paddy McNair and Duncan Watmore, the latter of which I've just searched, and he's 28 years old. I didn't realise.
Yeah.
Obviously, he
Yeah.
came through the Sunderland Academy. That was probably about 10 years ago now, I think, when he came through. But obviously, he moved on to Middlesbrough, I think it was 2, possibly 3 years ago nearly. Paddy McNair, obviously, once Sunderland got relegated into League One, which now seems like a lifetime ago. How have them two got on this season so far for Middlesbrough?
So yeah, it's an interesting one. As Sunderland fans will remember with Duncan Watmore, he of course suffered those two terrible knee injuries at Sunderland, which pretty much took away 3 years of his career at such an awful time. And of course, back then I was covering Sunderland, so I kind of witnessed all of that with him, and by the time he got back to properly playing again, he'd gone from being a Premier League player and an exciting England under-21 international to suddenly finding himself at Sunderland, who were now in League One. And of course, that was such a difficult division. A lot of bullies in that division, I remember. He finally kind of got himself back to playing in League One, got a bit of form going. And I always remember somebody crunched him, didn't I? Can't remember what game that was now. I think he'd come on and possibly even scored, maybe. I don't know, my memory not quite good, but I remember he got crunched, and that's kind of League One for you. The recognised a player like Duncan Watmore, like to get on the ball, like to run at people, was fast, and ultimately the answer in League One is just we'll stick a foot in and we'll crunch that, and he struggled. So I think ultimately when Sunderland decided to release Duncan Watmore, it made a lot of sense in terms of, I think, both parties, both sides just needed a kind of fresh start and a parting of the ways. And Duncan, of course, struggled to find a club initially, and there was talk of potentially moving to India and even stuff like that. And as luck would have it, on his part at least, Middlesbrough at the start of that season, which start of the season before last, Ashley Fletcher suffered an injury, and it left them short up at the top of the pitch, and in came Duncan Watmore in the November, I think it was, as a free transfer. And he's not really looked back since. I think Sunderland fans will all remember what a great attitude Duncan had, and how much effort he always put into things, and he's very much been the same in his time at Boro. Is actually playing mainly as a striker in his time at Boro, and I think he scored 10 goals after coming in that first season in the November, and ultimately that made him Boro's top scorer that season. And he's one player who's really brought into to Wilder's style, Wilder's system, because he really likes his forwards to press hard and really go after the ball in the final third and give defenders no time on the ball. And as Sunderland fans will remember, Duncan's more than happy to do that. In terms of this season, it's been a bit more difficult for him. Boro have tried and have brought in quite a few strikers, but the conditioning issue is the big thing for him. As I say, because of those two knee injuries, he struggles to play 3 games in a week, which quite often you do in the Championship. So it's inconsistent in terms of he's quite often in and out of the team. He's an interesting player now in terms of the way Boro are going. Ideally, kind of Duncan would have probably almost dropped out of the reckoning, or at the very least become, the 4th or 5th option this season of 4 or 5. He would have been the lower end of your kind of striker options had Boro's summer transfer window come to plan. As it happens, they didn't get a kind of senior experienced striker that they ultimately wanted this summer, and so Duncan's going to ultimately have to play an important part. Again, he's not had, by his standards, not the best of starts. He's missed a couple of golden opportunities so far this season in his first couple of appearances, and he'll certainly hope to improve on that. He did get his first goal recently, so fingers crossed it'll come together, because he is a great player on his day, and as I say, in terms of the tactical style of pressing hard and things like that, he is perfect for it. But he admits himself he has to kind of manage that knee injury still. He still gets issues with the knee, so he does have to manage that. And so yeah, I would he's on his day he's brilliant, but he's also capable of some bad misses at times as well. And for Boro, a team who at the minute are conceding a lot of goals, they can't afford to be wasting chances that Duncan often does. So that probably sums him up. It's been a strange start of the season for Paddy McNair, because as I mentioned, he'd been playing as the left centre back, but Wilder was clear he wanted that balance, and he needed a left-footed centre back, which eventually he's got with Matt Clark. And with Paddy McNair, he's had a strange career in that he's almost played all over, hasn't he? He's been a midfielder, he's been a centre back, he's even been a wing back, or a full back.
I think even the season when Sunderland had him in the Championship as well, I think because of how poor Sunderland did that season, I think he did get criticism, but he always stood out as one of the best players Sunderland had that season. And he's definitely a top-end Championship midfielder / defender / wherever you want to play him.
Yeah, I mean, he's got fantastic ability. There's no doubt in that. And I think sometimes with versatile players like that, the difficulty can be, finding your place in the team and cementing that. And at Boro, because the options are limited now, I think, ultimately, when looking at transfer deadline day, they wanted 2 central midfielders because they needed more depth in that position. They ultimately play with 3 central midfielders and now only have 4 on the books because they haven't managed to get the 2 that they wanted in on deadline day. And ultimately, what's happened in an ideal world, Boro's strongest 11, Paddy McNair would be the right-sided centre back. That's where Wilder likes him. It's where Wilder sees him playing, permanently. It's where Wilder believes he's at his best. The issue has been, as I say, because of that lack of depth in midfield. They had Matt Crooks, who is one of the very good midfielders. He missed 3 games with illness, so Paddy McNair had to step up into the midfield to cover for him. In the last game at Watford, Johnny Howson, who kind of sits in the deep lying midfield role, he had to come off at half time at Watford. So Paddy McNair had to leave the centre back role again and go to defensive midfield. So 3 different roles that Paddy McNair's already played this season. And unfortunately, we talked about the fact that Boro, keep conceding sloppy goals. I think a big part of that as well is that in terms of selection, they haven't been able to name any consistency so far because they're having to shuffle things particularly with Paddy McNair, etc. And I think when you look and you see that back 3, your strongest back 3 of Paddy McNair, Darragh Lenihan, and Matt Clark, 2 of those players are new signings at the club. So clearly, you want that selection consistency so they can gel and get to know each other better, and that better understanding will lead to better structure, etc. But because of the way the season's gone so far for Boro, they haven't been able to really do that yet.
Yeah. As you mentioned before, you did used to cover Sunderland, and a lot's changed at the club since then, probably for the better.
Yeah.
Most importantly, obviously, the league of which we're playing in. Obviously, spent 4 seasons in League One, got promoted through the playoffs last season, obviously with Alex Neil in charge, who has since left to join Stoke. But I think the biggest thing that's changed outside of that is the recruitment at Sunderland. And I'm sure you've seen it, the type of players that Sunderland have brought in this season are very different from the types of people you were probably reporting on at the time. The likes of Danny Graham when he re-signed, Darren Gibson, Gilabodji and Dong. Players that, to put it frankly, would come here for a pay packet, move on, and never really do anything with the career. And if you look at the players that we've signed this season, you obviously got Dan Ballard, who's a highly rated centre-back from Arsenal, spent last season on loan at Millwall. Unfortunately for him, he is probably going to be injured until after the World Cup. But the likes of Edouard Michu from PSG, 19-year-old midfielder, international player for France's under-20s, I think it is. The likes of Amad Diallo on loan from United, Abdullah Bar from France. So young players coming in to, develop with the club as the club move forward. Middlesbrough have been in the Championship for a few seasons now, so you'll know what it takes to kind of compete in this league and what works and what doesn't. With the way Sunderland are recruiting nowadays, how do you think that will go for Sunderland moving forward?
I think it's a really interesting one, and I must admit I admire the recruitment strategy at Sunderland. And in my time covering the club, it always felt like Sunderland were ultimately firefighting 90% of the time, never really having much of a clear strategy, particularly during the Premier League years. It was, stay in the Premier League at all costs, and that would mean switching from manager to manager without ever really allowing a manager to build anything, without ever really having a clear strategy. One manager would have one style, one manager would have another style. And, there weren't appointing managers, with similar styles, with similar strategies, with similar, kind of preferences to how teams play. And that meant that, ultimately by the end, the squad was all over the place because it was a squad that come together from so many different managers and so many different ideas of the best way to play, and those players were ultimately brought in for that style. So there was no balance and no kind of direction within the squad. So I think now what it appears from the outside looking in at Sunderland is there is a clear strategy, and there is a clear direction and vision for the club, which I think in the modern game now, I think accelerated by COVID as well. I think clubs have started to realise that the way that they've been operating it is not sustainable, and the kind of losses of clubs, particularly in the Championship and further down in the EFL, but even in the Premier League. I mean, we all talk about how much money's in the Premier League, but even just to stay in the Premier League, the money you have to spend to try and keep up with the rest means that so many clubs aren't turning over a profit in the Premier League despite all that money. I think there's a recognition now, as I say, accelerated by COVID and all the losses for something so unpredictable, that things need to be run a bit better now and a bit more sustainably at clubs. And I think Brentford ultimately, probably were the shining example of the model that Sunderland and also Middlesbrough are trying to do something very similar now as well, where ultimately you're signing players who you consider assets. They're at good ages, and you believe they have ability, but you believe there's potential to make them better and potentially sell them on at a profit in years to come. And I think it's ultimately, I think, the right strategy to go down. It'll become harder. Brentford have had a lot of success with it, but Brentford, while they were doing it, were kind of almost alone in doing it. The more and more clubs who kind of cotton on to the idea that this is a good way to operate, the more competition there's ultimately going to become for these players who you would describe as maybe hidden talents, untapped potential, those kind of words. They're not going to be so hidden anymore because everybody's going to be looking for them. But within that, you would then hope that market values within England become more reasonable. This summer, I know Middlesbrough inquired about, well, Chris Wilder would only say that they inquired about a Championship goal scorer. I believe it was Gyökeres at Coventry, and I apologize because that's an awful name to pronounce. I'm not sure if I did that justice, but Sunderland have already seen his ability this season, even though I don't believe he really did much over the 90 minutes, did he? But then scored that late goal, late equaliser, and ultimately that's what a good striker's there to do. But I believe it was him who Boro inquired about at the start of the summer, and we're told 20 million. I mean, he's a good player, he's a good goal scorer, he scored goals, etc. in the Championship, but 20 million for any player in the Championship is absolutely ridiculous. So you would hope in time that the market in England kind of realigns itself and becomes more realistic. But certainly at the moment, I think it's a good. It looks a good strategy from the outside looking in what Sunderland are trying to do. Of course, you've just appointed Tony Mowbray, who we know well down in Middlesbrough, and he's very good at working with young players and developing young players as well. So that feels like a good fit. The one issue, I think the Championship is a very demanding league. It still has its physicalities, although Sunderland, know about physical with League One. Depth would be my major concern. I think there's as we've seen in the opening weeks of the season, there's a kind of very good 11 there, and maybe 2 or 3 beyond the 11 that come into the team. But as the season goes on, particularly in this, it's a very strange season because of the break in
World Cup.
November for the
Yeah.
World Cup. Yeah, makes it very strange and will lead to a bit of a fixture congestion throughout the season in other years where there might have been kind of gaps Saturday to Saturday and not as many midweekers. This season there is going to have to be more midweekers because of that break for the World Cup. And as the season goes on, I do worry that Sunderland's depth might take its toll, and hopefully before that they can pick up enough points so that they're comfortably in a safe position and maybe even challenging upper end of the table, but yeah, certainly in the Championship, one thing I've noticed over the last couple of years is depth is quite often very important towards the back end of the season.
Yeah. Well, last thing before we wrap it up, in terms of how Sunderland will probably line up, obviously they brought in 4 new players since the game against Rotherham. Obviously Amad Diallo from Man United, Abdul Bar, Edward Michu, and Jason Bennett was obviously at the club before then, but was never going to play. Whether they feature at all on Monday is yet to be seen, but I highly doubt they will start. So in terms of a starting 11, I would expect it to be unchanged from the Rotherham game, which is of course Patterson, Gooch, O'Nien, Bart, Sirkin and Clark, with Corey Evans-Daniel in midfield, Alex Pritchard, Ross Stewart and Ellis Sims as a front 3. But last thing before I let you go, Craig, I don't know if you do score predictions, but I'm going to try and push you for one anyway. Going to be a tough game. Obviously, like I said, Middlesbrough have only won once so far this season. They're going to want to win on Monday, pick up 3 points, and going to be an interesting one. But if you had to go for a score prediction, or at least a result prediction, what would you go for?
It's a tough one. I tell you what, the games I've managed to see of Sunderland this season, that front 2 in particular of Stewart and Sims looks very, very good and will hurt or certainly cause problems for most Championship defences this season. They look very good together. And as I say, Boro have had the problems defensively, but it tends not to be a structural issue. They've tended to handle much of what's come up against them so far this season and have ultimately shot themselves in the foot. Having said that, the atmosphere at the Riverside has been very good this season, and with the exception of a cup defeat where they were ultimately playing kids, they've been undefeated so far this season at home. And played some good teams in West Brom, Sheffield United, and then obviously beat Swansea. It's going to be tough. It'll be a great atmosphere with Sunderland fans, no doubt, coming down in numbers. And Riverside always has a great atmosphere anyway. I think Middlesbrough need to win. I think they need to pick me up. I think they'll have a bit more Championship know-how on the night. So I will go for it. I think it'll be tight. It'll be quite cagey, but I'll go for a narrow Middlesbrough win.
Fair enough. I'm fancying a draw. I can see a 2-2 draw. I think both teams have, especially up front, players that will cause damage to each other's defence, and I think it will be a close game, but I do think it will end in a draw, which probably favours Sunderland at this stage of the season more than it does Boro. But of course, that is yet to be seen. Of course, that is on Sky Sports on Monday night. But we'll wrap it up there. I appreciate you taking the time to join us, Craig.
Thanks very much, Josh. Pleasure being on.
No worries. Of course, we'll be back on Tuesday to provide a reaction to Monday's game, everything that happened, player ratings and whatnot. And in the coming future, we'll also have a podcast out to talk about all of Sunderland's deals in the deadline, not in the deadline day, in the transfer window. Obviously, Carl Winchester left to join Shrewsbury on loan. Quite a few incomings, 10 for Sunderland. So all of that will be discussed in a future podcast. But until then, we will see you later.
That's all, folks.